Cairo, Illinois sits at the southernmost point of the state, known as the Land of Lincoln. The Ohio River stands as a mighty border between Illinois and Kentucky to the south. Today, Cairo is a poor and depressed community. The population is declining. Attracting new businesses here is difficult. The young people seem to be more interested in fulfilling their dreams elsewhere, not here in a community which seems to be devoid of many promising lifelong opportunities. Yet there is more, for far beneath the obvious gloom of this river town lie the menacing scars of decades of bigotry, oppression, and racism. While Cairo is the southernmost city in Illinois, it is also the southernmost city in the Catholic Diocese of Belleville. And it is the Catholic Church which has both led the fight against racism here and unwittingly encouraged it.
Covert racism and subtle racism is still very much alive in the church. When one decides the limits, the horizons, the capacity, the ability, the strength, the courage, the ingenuity, the industriousness of an individual based on his or her race, that is racism. And whether you consider your opinions particularly enlightened or particularly informed, if you impose them without the ability to see that people of color might not live according to your expectations, that's racism. And so in explaining to people the racist attitudes that may have been present and certainly were present in the lives of clergy and religious and clerics and bishops of an earlier era, I don't exonerate them. I recognize them. I stand before God's altar and I pray for those people. I do so not in a sense that I'm trying to deny it, but in a sense that because I am Catholic, I am a follower of Christ, I struggle to be a disciple, I must also struggle to forgive.
The pockmarks this city of Cairo continues to bear are emblematic of this nation's celebrated civil rights movement. While places like Montgomery and Selma, Alabama, and people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. made national headlines and were so often the lead stories on the network news broadcasts, there were others who would make virtually no headlines for the fights they would fight to guarantee basic human rights to all people. People like Preston Ewing, a native of Cairo, a man whose grandfather was a slave. During the height of the battle here for equality, he was the chairman of the local chapter of the NAACP. He is also an historian who vividly remembers the racial unrest and conflict that even today seem as much a part of this community as the mighty river that borders it to the south.
Well, growing up here was a community in which, there were blacks and whites. We lived in close proximity to each other. And at some point in my life, I realized that there were separate institutions and certain practices that separated blacks from whites. But I lived on a block that contained both blacks and whites. So, I grew up playing with white kids, but I knew they went to different schools, different churches, different movie theaters, that they could go to the swimming pool, but we had to go to the Ohio River and swim and things of that nature. So it was clear that it was a separate community with separate churches and things of that nature. But I knew nothing to compare it with, because that was this community, and having been born here and having lived here until finishing high school, I had nothing to compare it to.
I remember when I was little, and even when I was in high school, you could go downtown and go down 8th Street and down Commercial for probably 4 blocks, and there was a store in every building on both sides of the street. There were shoe stores and clothes stores and drug stores and all different kinds of stores, dime stores, everything. And there's nothing down there now. There are no stores downtown in Cairo now. And we could go down there and shop. And people used to come to Cairo from Kentucky and Missouri to shop and go to the doctor. And now you have to go to Sikeston, Cape, Paducah, Carbondale, wherever.
The Diocese of Belleville covers some 12,000 square miles and extends its pastoral leadership to Catholics in 28 counties throughout southern Illinois. Its history is full of bigotry and oppression. Those parts of its past are painful and difficult. The Catholic Church itself has not always been a beacon of hope. Father Joseph Brown is chairman of the Department of American Black Studies at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Father Brown, who teaches literature and black history, was the first African American ever ordained to the priesthood in the Belleville Diocese.
The Catholic Church has been racist. Not everybody in it, not everywhere, not at all times. In Southern Illinois and East St. Louis, yes, it has had a racist history. Yes, its leadership has been sometimes infamous and notorious in its meanness towards black people. But that's historical.
The people of Western Europe who came to this nation as immigrants, especially those who came as Catholics, were victims of bigotry and injustice. There is no question that they suffered because of their faith, because of their language, because of their heritage. But in the United States, they had one trump card going for them. They were white. And eventually, they learned the language. And eventually, their faith, our faith, grew in its acceptance in the American arena. And therefore, the racism that they experienced was not a racism that endured, or it was a racism that could eventually be set aside as people grew through the various experiences of intolerance, when the language and the culture and the traditions were eventually folded into the American landscape. But not so for people of color. When we acknowledge the fact that many groups within the United States have been victims of bigotry and racism, we must also ask the question, are there qualitative differences between the experience of racism on the part of one group over another? And I would have to say that there are differences. First of all, the racism and the bigotry that people of color have endured has perdured. It has continued because it's visible. We as bishops are faced with a very significant challenge. We have to help our people see the close union, the close bond between faith and social justice, doctrine and practice, morality and dogma, that it is not possible to be a good Catholic without seeing the challenges of the gospel, not just in what we believe, but in how we act.
The issue of civil rights is not always about the color of someone's skin. In fact, racism, prejudice, bigotry, and ethnic conflict have historically been fueled by economic struggles. Skin color only deepens the divide. As the 20th century began, industrialization was reshaping the face of America. Throughout southern Illinois, the struggle centered on jobs and pay. It was about feeding a family or going hungry. The barriers, in reality the battle lines, became issues of language, homeland, and the color of a person's skin. In 1917, a battle over jobs in East St. Louis accelerated into one of the bloodiest race riots in our nation's history. Officially, 39 blacks and 8 whites were killed. Some accounts, however, place the death toll at nearly 400 men, women, and children. In the 1920s, coal mining had grown to become one of Southern Illinois' biggest industries. New waves of immigrants, the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, and the East Europeans, made up a good portion of the workforce. Poor pay and poor working conditions led often to lengthy work stoppages. Mine owners, concentrating on bottom-line profits, were slow to change. Rather than meet any of the miners' demands, they would import scab labor from places like Kentucky and Tennessee. Many of those workers were black. In 1922, in the small mining town of Herrin, Illinois, striking miners killed 20 unsuspecting strikebreakers and wounded dozens more in what would come to be called the Herrin Massacre. The dead are buried, all but forgotten, in the local cemetery. In the nearby community of West Frankfort, the Italian community also struggled to provide for its families. Hatred and violence dramatically escalated there to the point that the area became known as Bloody Williamson County. Wilma Finazzo was a little girl at the time.
I would say I was afraid because I wasn't so much afraid for myself, but for my dad and mother, you know, because they were the foreign-born.
Many immigrant families in the area found the Catholic Church to be a welcome sanctuary.
The Catholics weren't thought of very much in West Frankfort because this town was really a Baptist town. Most people were Baptist, and they resented it's not like that today.
While many would look to the 1950s and 60s as the beginning of the demise of Cairo, it actually began much earlier, when city leaders actively looked for ways to separate the races.
So after about 1910-13, which up until then had been Cairo's height of prosperity, things went downhill. About the time that they disenfranchised blacks, they changed the form of government from aldermanic, where blacks had been elected to city council, judges, county government, to an at-large form. And after that, that's kind of everything went. And that was when Jim Crow actually arrived in Cairo. Not 1870 or 1870, but it was much later.
By the early 1920s, Jim Crow laws were in full force in southern Illinois, and Cairo in particular. Jim Crow laws essentially made racial segregation and discrimination legal. No one knows exactly how the name Jim Crow came to represent the laws that would effectively make African Americans second-class citizens in the United States. But Jim Crow was the name of the minstrel character created when whites performed in blackface to mimic African American stereotypes. Those Jim Crow laws, along with an increasing membership in the Ku Klux Klan, forced segregation in all areas of daily life. Prejudice and bigotry also marred the Catholic Church's vision of being one in the body of Christ.
If I had the power to change the Church's approach to civil rights or racial harmony or racial justice, I guess that I would call us to be more cognizant of our history. I would invite Catholics to reflect on their own individual history and heritage, where they came from. Which is the great strength of Catholicism. We are a church rooted in our heritage, and our heritage is as ancient as Christianity. And so I guess one of the things that I would invite us to do would be to embrace the fullness of our Catholicity.
Cairo was a city with Southern sympathies dating to the Civil War era. It was also one of the last major battlegrounds of the Civil Rights Movement. By the late 1950s, Cairo was well on its way to becoming one of the poorest and most racially polarized cities in America. As the civil rights movement spread, the community was challenged to look for new ways to effect social justice and equality. The faith of black Christians was a sustaining force.
If I had to comment on the era of the late 50s and early 60s, the post-conciliar time in the life of the Diocese of Belleville, I would describe it probably as an example of what was going on throughout the church. There was the appearance of a young group of priests who had been trained and prepared for priesthood in the shadow of the council and its post-conciliar actions. They were young priests who were very sensitive to the social dimensions of justice. I believe that the priests, the senior pastors who were in authority at that time, probably didn't understand the spiritual or the social fervor of their young curates as they were coming in, and you had a generational conflict, an intergenerational conflict. You had young priests pushing for a social gospel and pushing for social activism. You had senior pastors who were there to maintain the status quo and there to keep the church in line with the ecclesial vision that they had. And so there were bound to be conflicts. But there was also something that took place in the diocese which was inevitable too. The young tempered the old tempered the young.
In the late 1960s, 2 young priests were reassigned by Bishop Albert Zerowist from parishes in East St. Louis to St. Columba Parish in Cairo. For Father Jerry Montroy and Father Ben Bo Davis, the ensuing years would profoundly impact their lives and the entire community of Cairo. They would provide a Catholic presence and play a pivotal role in the battle for racial equality.
My real interest was in developing liturgy and working with black Catholics, but then I was asked by the bishop to go to Cairo, Illinois, and to do social work there, which I said, fine, I'd love to do it. Basically, it was I was asked to go to Cairo and not to do pastoral work, but to just go down and see what I could do to help. There was a lot of pressure by young Catholic priests and nuns in the Belleville Diocese that the bishop do something for the black communities. There was an attempt in East St. Louis by Father Schumacher first and then Father Lucy to do something to bridge the gap between whites and blacks. I was sent down to Cairo to do the same thing.
Michael Lucy was also a Catholic priest at the time, working in a social ministry in East St. Louis. A friend of Father Montroy and Father Bo Davis, he made frequent trips to Cairo to help them in their efforts to bring about social justice.
I miss the active priesthood. I consider my proudest moment in life to be able to say I am a civil rights priest. And if they could put something on my tombstone, it would be, here lies a civil rights priest. Because you were the most direct with people. It was the most closest to people that I've ever gotten. When we were in jail in Springfield, and we were in there for the 5 nights and days, you really get to know people. They were poor people. And when I came out of it, I didn't see the cause as working with blacks. It was working with poor people. It made no difference if you were black or white. you still need health insurance, you need a job, you need human dignity. And during that active priesthood, that was a tremendous high.
Jerry Montroy, Benbow Davis, and Michael Lucy would all eventually leave the priesthood. Today, Montroy and Lucy both work at the same law firm in East St. Louis. Their work remains deeply rooted in the civil rights movement. They do not see what they did in Cairo as heroic or exemplary. Rather, they did as Jesus taught, to love one another and lift up our brothers in Christ.
I think that what Jerry Montroy and others like him did is a contemporary form of martyrdom. You bleed, and the church is nourished by it and grows up. I don't believe anything is final in the Catholic Church, and I think that they sacrificed a lot, and they were willing. And I don't see them as failures. I don't see them as impotent. I see them as witnesses to a kingdom that's always coming into existence.
But we now feel that the contribution that was made to our civil rights movement activities was made by St. Columba Church, which is a part of the Catholic system, even though it was not something that was established from above in the powers that be that make decisions in the Catholic Church. It was the two priests who were here who were somewhat outraged at the fact that in 1967 and 68, some of these practices were still taking place in Illinois, and they had strong feelings that the church had a responsibility to play a leadership role. So they not only took the risk of alienating local whites and alienating local white Catholics in the other church, but they took the risk of losing the acceptance of their bishop, and they risked their lives. They lived in a rectory that had a history, as we reflect upon it, of being shot up by the police and other vigilantes with bullet holes and things of that nature. So there are even instances of where the state police had to use an armored vehicle to rescue them and others from the rectory late one Saturday night because it was under attack for gunfire from the police station and other places. So they played a significant role.
The people wanted it. I mean, the black people wanted it. They wanted to be able to be Catholic. They wanted to be able to worship. There had been many years of tradition of the black Catholic Church in Cairo, and they were several generations of black Catholics there. And they did not want to go to a church where they weren't wanted. And they were very much not wanted there.
He was sent by Bishop Zerwest to go to Cairo to develop a ministry there. And when he got there, he discovered what many throughout the country had discovered, that the boil of racism was popped. And in our corner of the world, it was popped in a big way. It exposed itself in Cairo, Illinois. And he was very vocal. He joined up with people who were working in the community to overcome it. And he spoke up. And when you spoke up down there, you opposed the vast white power structure that for all those years, similar to other parts of the United States, had held sway. And you were raining on their parade.
My primary goal was to bring together the black and the white people of that community. After several months and several incidents, I became aware that that was impossible. I could not just sit down, talk to whites, talk to blacks, bring them together, it wasn't going to work that easy.
Actually, it was in May of '68 that he was first sent there. Like most places in the South, Cairo was very segregated in terms of church membership. The Catholics had finally had a black Catholic church, I think about 1923 or 1928, and it wasn't until later on that they had a Catholic school there that was attached to a church called St. Columba's, which was on 14th Street. And so there was a church, a rectory, and a school building. And by the time that Jerry Montoy had gotten there in 1968, they basically, about May, they decided to desanctify the Catholic Church and combine the St. Columba's and St. Patrick churches, or parishes, whatever you want to call it. There's also a St. Joseph Church, which had been a German church. So when he got there, the blacks were supposed to be going to St. Patrick's, but they didn't feel very welcome there.
It would have been marvelous for the Catholic Church to be more openly and actively engaged in the civil rights struggle of the people of color in those parts of our diocese where the rights of people of color were clearly being overlooked and being denied. I would have to say that I wish that the church had been more forthright in its open endorsement of the goals of the Civil Rights Act activities in the 60s. I would have to also be somewhat benign because there were priests of this diocese who were actively involved.
And then I began to think of who had benefited from the Civil Rights Movement. And then I began to think of who had contributed to the Civil Rights Movement. And then in thinking of the churches, I realized that while it was not part of a plan or an intent, history shows, if you analyze it and you're objective about it, that the black Catholic Church, apart from the white Catholic Church or St. Columba, played a major role, because whoever controlled the church locally at some point made a significant decision that the church should host some of the organizational activities and supportive activities to assist the civil rights movement in sustaining itself. So we began to use St. Columba Church with Father Montroy and Father Bo Davis being our host, and at the same time being a part of the coalition of organizations and individuals that we had brought together, that we would use their facility for our weekly rallies, which were then followed by marches to the downtown area, and then there would be the picketing of stores in the downtown area. We found that our civil rights movement needed to really become a sort of a sophisticated organization, for the lack of a better word. So we needed offices to conduct various aspects associated with getting the information out to the people, having meetings, having rallies, and even having social activities. And church activities were still going on in the Black Catholic Church, but there was support from it. Now, we knew that there was opposition from the White Catholic Church a few blocks down the street, but we knew that they were victims of the long-established order in Cairo, and they were not free socially to support a civil rights organization, even though there were probably some among their membership who were favorable toward our efforts to some degree.
Well, they invented their own law. Montroy and some of the later civil rights lawyers who had arrived within a couple of years said there was law and then there was Cairo law. And so, like I said, the judges would put people in jail for non-jailable offenses. They wouldn't grant them bail, and they just put them in for the weekend and let them out. There was also in 1967 a young African-American man, Robert Hunt, was found dead in the jail. And they claimed that, like in South Africa, he had hung himself with his T-shirt. However, a number of his relatives and other people in Cairo, and you can talk to Press and Union about this, saw his body, and he had been beaten severely, and they claimed that, or alleged that he had been murdered by the Cairo police. And so that was kind of the situation. That had happened the summer before Montroy came to Cairo, and so that was very much on the minds of the people.
Well, the most significant event was the death of Private Robert L. Hunt, July 15, 1967, who was a black soldier who was found where he had been hung in the Cairo police station. And the story was that he had hung himself. It wasn't a believable story in the black community, so it led to the first protest in about 3 years. Prior to that, 1964, there had been some civil rights activity, and that brought people together. His death, and through marches, and there were arrests as a result of the march. So we knew then that we had the ingredients of initiating a full-blown civil rights movement.
The effort to restore civil rights in Cairo took its most visible form on the weekends. Those working for social justice staged protest marches every Saturday afternoon. Rallies began peacefully at St. Columba School, but the retaliation from opponents of social justice was often violent.
The year I graduated from high school, I had a full-time job as the clerk of the police department, and this was when everything was going on, when there were marches every Saturday afternoon, and there were fights, and there were pickets, and there were fires on the nights. Mostly every weekend you'd come into town and you could see the sky was kind of pink, and you knew there was a fire, and they'd be rerouting traffic off of the highway because they were being shot at, or there were hoses across the street or whatever. So that's what I remember about it.
So most of the fear came at night. It was frightening to know the next morning that the rectory had been shot into overnight, or some people in public housing spent the night in a bathtub, because there was gunfire between public housing and the police station, or some vigilantes on the levee and things of that nature. We were always conscious of the danger as a result of this, because 2 people were killed, 1 black and 1 white, during this period.
There were many close calls. Montroy remembers one night when he and a group of adults rescued some black teenagers from the junior high school, where they were watching a basketball game.
I received a telephone call from Preston Ewing, and he told me of what had happened. So I immediately went over to the migrant school. It was after dark, and I asked the people or I told them what was happening. So I think there must have been about 40 black men and women. So we went en masse up to the school. We got the kids in between us, and we were on the outside, and we walked them back from the junior high school, some 10 or 12 blocks, to Pyramid Court so they would be safe. What was really interesting about that was that people were standing there with guns. And I remember specifically the person I had gone to, who was a Boy Scout leader. He was carrying a gun, and I walked up to him, and with that he picked up his gun. It was like a shotgun, and he put it in my belly. And I said, "How can you do this?" I said, "It was just a month ago. I was in your home, and I talked to you about setting up a scout unit for both black and white kids. And I said, how can you stand here and put a gun in my stomach?" I had a significant number of death threats, telephone calls in the middle of the night, and from people who just, said, we're going to kill you, or this or that. The first few were frightening. After that, it was just a telephone call. I hung up, and the lieutenant governor from the state, Paul Simon, who then became a representative and then a senator, who's now retired. He gave me his private number at home, and you know, I would talk to him on a regular basis when there was a lot of shooting going on, and so that I had contact with someone. The only time that I really thought I was going to be killed was, quite frankly, after I left Cairo, and I went 1 year of law school, came back, and the night that I came back, the White Citizens Council and the police surrounded the rectory where Father Bodavis and I lived and shot it up. I mean, just destroyed the rectory and tear gassed us, and we went to hide in the church and tear gassed that, and I mean, the house was just unlivable following that, and we were finally rescued by the state police in an armored anti-personnel carrier. So that was the only time that it was really very imminent. Our house had been shot into one other time, but nobody was home at that time. So, I mean, that wasn't a fear.
I have an awful lot of respect for him, because when he was first ordained, there he was as part of my family's church. And he was the kind of priest I would have known growing up, because we were all studying the same thing. We were being taught, again, a new generation of social justice. That for him, it was common sense. So I'm always going to have a lot of respect for whatever he did.
Vatican II provided an extraordinary benchmark in the life of the Catholic Church. Prior to this time, the work of priests and religious and of the laity were clearly defined and separate. Vatican II blurred the division between clergy and laity. While each had their own special emphasis, laity and clergy alike were now called to work for conversion in both the Church and the world. Since that time, the Catholic Church has been undergoing its own conversion on the issues of racism, prejudice, and intolerance. Racism hides in society in subtle ways. In the Diocese of Belleville, the white priests and religious men and women who ministered in the African American community developed a new sensitivity to prejudice and bigotry. They too were frequently the victims of intolerance because of their work and stand on social issues. As the civil rights movement grew, more and more white priests and religious stepped forward as active participants. The story of black Catholics became deeply interwoven with the stories of white men and women who struggled for racial justice, both inside and outside the walls of the church.
There was a tremendous responsibility as priest. As long as you held the post, civil rights priest, you had to do whatever you had to do. Yeah, there was a tremendous obligation. I've never felt anything since like that obligation.
I realized that I was sort of doing what Martin Luther King thought about, and it's what he said about choosing people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And I remember even telling whites that what was necessary was not something that they were not doing, they just had to add something to it. And I would say that I, as a black person, I choose black people based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. You, as a white person, you in your culture, you choose whites based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So you already have developed this system of choosing people based on the content of their character. So if you're colorblind, then I can put blacks and whites out here before you, and you should choose them irrespective of color, but by the content of their character. So that, I realize now that that was probably my feelings, that here were people that I was judging by the content of their character. And they favored making sacrifices to achieve something that I was in favor of making sacrifices for. So we made a great partnership. And we went through a lot together. We were endangered together. You know, we shared the good and the bad together.
The Catholic priests in Cairo were not alone in their struggle to make a difference. In East St. Louis, religious women had been teaching in schools for decades.
I guess we would be called missionaries now, but I mean, at that time, it was just another school. We were teachers. Of course, it was straight out missionary work.
During that time of the civil uprisings, I never felt afraid, and I knew it was going on, but somehow I didn't think it was going to touch us right there in the area. And as I said, I wasn't afraid. And I know many people looked upon us and said, "Oh, what are those white ladies doing down there and on the other side of the tracks?" Well, that was fine. That's where we were supposed to be, and that's where we were going to be. Mm-hmm.
But a few of these religious women were called directly into the civil rights fracas. They marched in Selma, East St. Louis, and Cairo.
They've always been marching, and that seemed to be been their ethos for a long time. Many of the adorers who got involved in the Cairo movement, their habits were barely dry, and many of them had just taken their vows in the summer of 1969 when Montoy and Bo Davis sent a word up to the mother house at Ruma that they needed some teachers. And so a couple of the nuns, Sister Fran and Sister Carolyn, came down and taught some students.
During all of the marches and protests going on in the streets of Cairo, in another part of the diocese, in East St. Louis, a small group of sisters, members of the Adorers of the Blood of Christ, were, without incident, quietly integrating St. Teresa's Academy, a Catholic girls' high school.
And these are the nuns who've been involved in civil rights activities for as long as I can ascertain. They had their first integrated Catholic school, St. Teresa's Academy, in the St. Louis area.
The teaching of social justice to the students, the whole school, at all levels, the Christian teaching of social justice, that had all gone on for a long, long time, at least 10 years at the Academy. So our student body had a quite different feeling as far as racism is concerned than many of the older folks, not all, their parents, grandparents, because of the riots that had taken place in 1917, of which I only know that they were bloody and terrible and left memories that just stuck with the people. But the students were open. They were open to the message of Christianity. And they knew the teachers were enthusiastic about this as a basic Christian value. The faculty was convinced that racial separation was wrong, that integration was the right way for Catholics, for anybody, for human beings, because God created us equal. And secondly, as adorers of the blood of Christ, dedicated to that great mystery of love, Christ giving his life blood for the salvation of all, not for any particular color, or himself was a Jew. He wasn't a white folk. So our spirituality was oriented to no barriers, inclusive, not exclusive.
History records countless tales of man's struggle to follow Christ. For African Americans, the struggle has been especially difficult. For those who have experienced it firsthand, the evil of racism dredges up painful memories.
Well, I remember people talking about it. I remember when Father Burke was in the high school, and he took some people down to Georgia to see a ball game or they were on an excursion somewhere. And they were all seated around the table, and a couple of the black boys walked in, and they wouldn't serve them. They said, "No, we don't serve you." So Father took his whole team, got up, and they left the restaurant. So I remember him telling us that. Norman Fry, I remember him so well. He's a cute little kid. And I taught him in first grade, and during the summer he had a ruptured appendix. He had to go to the hospital. They took him to St. Mary's Hospital, but they would not accept him, so he died on the way to the next hospital. So I thought that was a terrible tragedy.
History would have us believe that the civil rights movement might be over. In reality, that is not true. Even in this new millennium, hatred and bigotry continue to be a visible part of the human condition.
The civil rights movement is still going on. It may not be going on in terms of marches and in terms of boycotts and in terms of protests and sit-ins, but it is going on in every Catholic home in this diocese, where young people need to be told and need to be formed and need to be shaped to be tolerant of people who are different. It is going on in every opportunity that is either denied or offered in East St. Louis for political, social, economic development of that community. It is going on in every neighborhood in Belleville and O'Fallon and Freeburg and Smithton, where a person of color might choose to live. It is going on in every opportunity that I, as the bishop of this diocese, gather with my people and tell them from the depth of my heart that I love them and I care for them, and that I consider it a great honor to be their pastor in Christ. The civil rights movement is still going on. It is still being achieved. It is still being accomplished, and there is much work to be done.
I feel that my life was enriched by my civil rights experiences here. And I feel a duty to, as I tell my daughters, to give back. Because my experiences during the civil rights movement here moved me to really dig into the history of America, not just history of blacks. And I sit here now with a deep appreciation and respect for people that I never know. I never will know, people who came long before I did. And I now enjoy many benefits, as do both blacks and whites, that are the results of people who did things that were unpopular. They were dangerous, things that cost them their lives, but somehow they had the courage in a different environment at a different time to do things that have helped make this a better country.
It was Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount who challenged his followers to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The Church teaches that deliberate hatred in any form is contrary to the charity Jesus calls us and challenges us to embrace. As followers of Christ, we are all called to come to the aid of anyone in need. All too often, our human frailty blinds us so that we do not see or understand that common bond we all have as God's people. While this story about African American Catholics and their struggles for equality is sometimes painful and always difficult, it is ultimately a story about hope, perseverance, and a call to a deeper faith that values a truly Catholic vision, a universal vision that all people of all races are indeed one in the body of Christ. In many ways, racism is about fear of what we don't understand. Breaking the barriers of color, language, and the silence of ignorance which has built up those barriers requires courage and an unwavering faith.
We are a people who have found such solace and hope and strength in a religious tradition that is grounded in prayer, is grounded in celebration, is grounded in Scripture, is grounded in a sense of the transcendent God. In a sense, black spirituality is very Catholic because it belongs to a people. It's a shared experience. It is a religious, spiritual vision that sees the individual as rooted in a community and as an individual who finds his identity within the community. Those are very Catholic realities. It is deeply scriptural. It is grounded in God's Word. And that's very sacramental, because the sacramental action of the church always rises out of a hearing of God's Word. The African American Catholics that I have met have embraced the church and been faithful under some extraordinary moments of sorrow and joyful. I've had people from our diocese, African American people, to tell me proudly of their experiences in the church, their love for the Irish pastors who came here as missionaries, their love for the school experiences that they had, and their fidelity to the church in spite of the obstacles that they have encountered. We are a faithful people. You're not going to chase us out of the church. If I were asked, why have African American Catholics stayed? I suppose it's the same reason that the martyrs would have faced death rather than rejection of their faith. They were absolutely convinced of the truth of what they had discovered. The faith is a powerful adhesive of the soul. And while it can be weakened and damaged, and while it can be offended, there is a dimension of truth that we have discovered in the church that no one can take from us. No one.
We'll carry on. And we'll be strong. As on and on we go to whatever may greet us ahead. We'll learn to shoulder the burden together, whatever the cost. So in the end, we'll look back at the trial